When you are going out and evaluating a new market, how do you prioritize and sequence those criteria to effectively identify, evaluate, and ultimately decide on purchasing sites?
Most important is that to assess whether we see or expect sufficient demand in that region. How we typically look into that.
Today's guest is Maarten Goeman, Vice President of Corporate Development at Mediterra Data Centers. With over 20 years in M&A and corporate finance, he's now building the AI data center platform Southern Europe didn't know it needed.
There are a lot of different perceptions around the data center industry. Data centers are consuming a lot of water. Is this something that people need to be concerned about, or is this hype?
There are data centers that are using water for cooling, and that's not necessarily everywhere bad. So what we are trying to do is to build our data centers with a dry cooling technology, basically, which means that we have a closed loop system. The water is just used to transport the cold into the data halls and thereby cooling the equipment.
People are saying, hey, we don't want data centers in our town because they theoretically consume a lot of resources, but at the same time, everyone's on their phones 24/7. How do you see the alignment of these two different worlds, the realities and expectations of the digital space these days?
I think the reality is
Paul Koetke is the founder of Koetke Consulting. He helps data center companies build the operational infrastructure to meet exponentially growing capacity demands.
Welcome to the Built to Scale podcast, where I interview leaders across the data center industry. I'm here today with my guest, Maarten Goeman, who is coming to us from Mediterra Data Centers. He started his career in corporate finance at ING and entered the data center world in 2021 through NorthC Data Centers. He is currently the VP of Corporate Development, responsible for the corporate development and M&A activities across Southern Europe for Mediterra Data Centers. Maarten, great to have you on.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks for the introduction, and thank you for having me here.
Well, hey, let's jump right into things here. So Mediterra is building out a pan-European colocation platform at a moment when AI infrastructure demand is rewriting the map. What drew you to this company, and why now within the industry?
So I think we started Mediterra roughly 2 years ago with the first acquisition that we did in Italy and Rome. We acquired a data center business called Cloud Europe. What we saw happening in Southern Europe is basically at the time what was already happening in, let's say, the northern part of Europe, in a way that the data center business was showing exponential growth. So what we believed is that we could copy the basically North Sea success story to a certain extent to the southern European countries. So the countries that we currently look into is basically Italy and Spain first and foremost, and also France and Portugal. What we believe is that on the one hand, AI is obviously going to drive growth further within the data center space, but AI is not the only thing that will drive the digitization of countries and companies. For that, you also need the more basic colocation services that we can provide. So that is what we are trying to build. Important for colocation services, and that's maybe a bit different from hyperscale AI/cloud services, is that we have a lot of individual customers, mostly corporates or government-linked bodies in our data centers, and they need to be in our data centers from time to time to basically swap a server, to do something physically in the data center, which means that our customers would like to be relatively close to the data centers that we have. And therefore, we are building a platform, a portfolio of locations across these countries to service the local needs and requirements of such customers.
That makes a lot of sense, having that local proximity so that those companies can not only host their business within the co-location data centers, but then also go there to provide in-person maintenance or change outs of servers as they need to. Now, Southern Europe isn't the first region that most people think of for co-location data center development. Sounds like you're building a pretty strong case for it. There's a lot of business within the region driving it. Of all the areas across Europe, what is driving your focus specifically on the Southern European region?
I think that's a fair question. I think that if you look at the digitization of Europe, I think that the UK and probably the northwestern part of Europe are a bit more advanced compared to the southern/the Eastern European part. So to that extent, we believe that ultimately these countries will also adapt to this digitization and therefore will grow significantly in the use of online services, which means that they, either directly or indirectly, will require data center capacity. That can happen via the large cloud providers, but obviously it could also happen via smaller data center providers like ourselves that cater for more specific requirements and needs of those companies. So we see an unmet demand that is developing as we speak, that is driven ultimately by the digitization and the status of the digitization of these countries and these regions, but is also helped and supported by the fact that the larger players, like the hyperscalers, have entered this market. And what you see happening there is that in the past, companies typically had a computer room somewhere in their building where they had the servers and they had air conditioning in there. And that is kind of how they did their IT. With cloud companies moving in first and foremost, these companies, these potential customers get acquainted with the fact that you can actually have your servers and your data off-prem, i.e. it is kind of moved from the smaller data centers that they have in their offices into the cloud. That provides a certain level of comfort if that works well. And then what we see happening most of the times is that the larger corporates ultimately have some sort of a hybrid strategy whereby part of the applications and the stack is running in the cloud and another portion might be in an individual data center, such as the ones that Mediterra is offering. So that is what we see happening now. That trend has already happened in the UK to a very large extent, in the Netherlands, in Germany, in Switzerland. So they're a bit ahead, if you will. But we believe that is also going to materialize in the Southern European countries. So we thought that it was a very good time to start building such a platform to cater for the needs of these type of customers.
That makes a lot of sense. You're seeing these countries that are a step or two ahead here. How much time do you think it's going to take for Spain, Italy, France to catch up with, say, the UK in terms of where they're at, given where they're at today? Is this a year or two? Is this 3 or 4 years? What does that time horizon look like?
I think 2 years is ambitious. I think it will take a bit longer, and I think you also have differences in countries. So if you, for instance, look at Italy, the northern part of Italy, especially the Milan region, where you have a large concentration of data centers already, is more advanced to that extent compared to maybe the mid or the southern part of Italy. We also see that happening in Spain, where there's a lot of focus in the Madrid region. So, which makes sense, obviously. I mean, it's the largest city, it's the largest economic area of Spain, whereas some other regions, there are not that many data centers at all. So to that extent, I would expect that especially the Milan area, but also the Madrid area, they're catching up. It will take a couple of years in any event, because it simply takes time to basically build data centers and to deliver them and to make them...
It's not easy.
It's not easy to make them accessible to customers. In other regions of these countries, it could also be a more fundamental discussion, i.e., are these corporates, are these companies, these governments actually already open to consider a move from their own data center on-prem to off-prem, and is the infrastructure there sufficient to support that? So I would think on average it will take a bit more than 2 years, and some regions might kind of catch up a bit earlier, but others I think will take a bit longer. So to get to the state where, let's say, the UK is today, I would think that 3 to 4 years is more realistic.
That makes a lot of sense. And there are just so many variables that go into building out a new data center, both from the physical construction side, but then also the regulatory side as well. In that vein, site acquisition requires so many different variables in here: power, connectivity, permitting, land, water, politics, all of that. When you are going out and evaluating a new market, how do you prioritize and sequence those criteria to effectively identify, evaluate, and ultimately decide on purchasing sites?
That's a good question. I think most important is that to evaluate a region or in evaluating a region would be to assess whether we see or expect sufficient demand in that region. So if that's a yes, then we would like to be there, which means then we need to obviously find the right location. Now, how we typically look into that, if we kind of take a city as example, we believe that we want to be in a, let's say, 45-minute driving radius around that city, because then it is relatively easy for customers to kind of get to our data center, do whatever they need to do in our data center and go back to their offices. So that is how we look at kind of the micro location. Then in terms of a specific plot of land, I think first and foremost, we need to understand whether the zoning plan would allow for a data center. Because if it doesn't do it, that zoning plan needs to be amended, which may take 2, 3, 4, 5 years. So that's typically not something we want to engage in because it's going to be a lengthy process with an uncertain outcome.
Carrying high risk.
Yeah, so then we would be acquiring a plot of agricultural land with the hope that we can convert that into a commercial use plot of land, which means that the zoning plan needs to be amended, etc., etc. So lengthy processes with a lot of risk. So typically, we prefer to look into locations that have a zoning plan that allows for a data center. Then the next important element is, can we get power? We typically would be looking for, let's say, 10 megawatts of grid capacity. So a complete different animal from the large developments that have been announced recently across the globe, I should say. So to that extent, our discussion with the grid connection company might be a bit easier. And so far, we have always been able to secure the power on the plots of land that we have identified. But that will be the second step. Thereafter, we always want to ensure that connectivity is available, or if not, is relatively easy to connect to backbone fiber routes that are hopefully nearby. And nowadays, you see that many countries have very developed fiber routes already. So typically that is not the biggest obstacle. And then the last question is obviously to speak to the municipality to understand whether they also would be supportive of having a data center. Even if the zoning plan allows for it, they still might have certain requirements that go above and beyond the typical zoning plan requirements. And I'm talking here specifically about sustainability, which is clearly a big thing nowadays within data centers. So to that extent, we always would like to have a discussion with the relevant authorities before we decide to make any definitive acquisition, to understand their position, to understand their requirements, and how they would like us to develop and build a data center, to make sure that that is aligned with also the Mediterra philosophy.
That makes sense. And as you're balancing all those different aspects here, and you're running this in multiple different countries, not even just within different regions within a single country, but all these different countries, all these different sites simultaneously, how do you manage that? What does good operational discipline look like for you? And where have you seen most teams fall short?
So let me try answering those questions. I think important is that no is also an answer. So we receive a lot of information and potential proposals of potential projects that we could participate in. What we try to do when kind of evaluating them is relatively quickly at least determine the ones that we don't want to look into. So don't spend too much time on projects that are either very complicated or that we don't believe in. So that obviously will help to focus on the right ones. We have teams in various countries with local people, which I think you need to literally speak the local language, but also to understand certain rules and regulations that differ from country to country and might even differ from region to region. So that helps us obviously to better evaluate opportunities, to have a solid network on the ground with relevant people, which may be advisors or brokers or technical advisors, you name it, that help us in projects, but also have ears on the ground to kind of inform us about something that could come to market and that could be of interest to
people who know the market really, really well, better than you do, to help you see the things that you can't see or predict locally.
Yes. Yep. We are still a relatively small company, which means that we can't possibly source all opportunities ourselves, right? So we have to rely on that local network, and therefore we do believe that you need to have local people, Mediterra people by that I mean, that have those connections, that have that network with, let's say, people in Italy or Spain or Portugal, as the case may be.
If you're going to be buying a plot of land in a new country, it makes a lot of sense to have someone who's done that many times before and working with a brokerage firm that does these for various industrial or even other data center plots as well.
Definitely. I think every country, sometimes even every region, has their own dynamics. And although buying a plot of land in itself doesn't sound too complicated, given that we want to tick a number of boxes, there will be variations in how countries and how regions kind of deal with that. So to that extent, yes, you want to have those local people. They have to speak the local language. And given that the Mediterra focus today is on 4 countries with 4 different languages, me being based out of the Netherlands, I don't speak all of them fluently enough to have that type of conversations, especially if it's going to be more detailed business/legal conversations. So then we would obviously use the local people. We would use local advisors, which can be, consultants, it can be brokers, it can be law firms, it can be bankers, depending on the projects. So that's what we do and try to do to make sure that whatever we acquire fits within our strategy. That's one. But secondly, also opportunities that we can actually execute upon, thereby eliminating risk as much as possible when we acquire, and not to ultimately have
being able to go back and say no to the wrong opportunities.
Exactly, and prevent us from buying something where we can never build a profitable data center. So I think that's the focus. So to me, focus is key. Not buying everything is also key, and that sounds obvious, but I think we have a quite rigorous approach to things, and there's a lot of checks and balances before we actually will sign to acquire, whether it's a plot of land, a development opportunity, or an existing data center platform.
Yeah. I really appreciate the bias to action and decision making in that, you get a lot of opportunities in life. Yeses are great. Nos are equally great, even though they don't always feel like it. But it's the maybes that will kill you, because those will drag on forever without a decision and consume time, resources, energy, and you don't get anywhere. Maybe you still get to a yes or no eventually, but it's much easier to be diligent about those and say, hey, this isn't the right fit. We need to keep looking. Or pursue other opportunities that we have in the market right now. I think that's a great piece to live by.
It is, although it is not always a clear yes or no, unfortunately.
That's true.
So
it's a big gray zone.
We also, from time to time, have some maybes, and sometimes those maybes turn into a yes, and sometimes they turn into a no. But indeed, what we want to prevent is to have that maybe on the table for 6, 9, 12 months, because that is indeed what you're referring to, Paul. I mean, that's going to drain resources, and with the limited resources we have, if they spend time on that one, they can't spend time on something more promising.
Exactly.
So there, at some point, we have to make the decision that the maybe will become a no.
So coming up on 2026 here, we're halfway through the year. What is your single biggest goal for Mediterra's corporate development function? And what would that mean for the business if you hit it?
So today we have 2 operational data centers. We have a project announced a couple of months ago. So we're building a data center in Barcelona. We have 2 other projects that have been secured, but that have not been announced. So we are basically on our route to have 5 operational data centers. What
Congrats.
I would like, thank you very much. So slowly but surely we are growing. What I would like to add this year, if possible, would be the acquisition of an operating data center platform, or data center or data centers, to not only have a greenfield operation and a development operation, but also in parallel to grow the business directly via the contribution of an acquisition in terms of revenues, in terms of EBITDA, in terms of customers, and obviously that should be in locations that we focus on. So most notably, again, focus on Italy and Spain first and foremost now.
That's really exciting. I know the amount of work that it takes to launch new data centers. So 2 new ones coming up this year, along with the one in Barcelona, is huge. Looking forward to seeing those announcements coming out, and having that diversified strategy for acquisition is going to be big for the business as well.
We hope so.
There are a lot of different perceptions around the data center industry, both within the public, within the industry itself too. One of the big ones that is around all the time, and I'm seeing in the news, I'm seeing it on LinkedIn, I'm seeing it all over the social media platforms, is that data centers are consuming a lot of water. And especially right now in the summertime, it's going to be really hot here this week. This water conversation keeps coming up. I see it all over the place. Tell me about that. Is this real? Is this something that people need to be concerned about, or is this hype?
I think, talking about water, most water that is being used by certain data centers is indeed used to cool the data centers, basically, right? To cool the servers. And there are data centers that are using water for cooling. And that's not necessarily everywhere bad, but especially in Southern Europe, where it's kept quite hot and where there might be a shortage of water, clearly consuming a lot of basically drink water, because that's what you're doing, is not very sustainable. So what we are trying to do is to build our data centers with a dry cooling technology, basically, which means that we have a closed loop system, a bit like a CV system at home for heating, which basically the water is just used to transport the cold into the data halls and thereby cooling the equipment. And with that also means that we're not using drinking water for cooling. We use dry coolers, which is basically air and compressors to cool down the closed loop water to transport the cold into the data halls. So to that extent, especially in regions where that's a big thing, we are not consuming or using any drinking water for cooling.
There's also a big paradox in the market right now that, everything, all this news that we're seeing is being hosted on some sort of social media platform, news platform, all of it being digital. There's kind of this disagreement here in that people are saying, hey, we don't want data centers in our town or our city because they theoretically consume a lot of resources. They're just these big blocks. Maybe they're a little bit noisy if you live next to it. But at the same time, everyone's on their phones 24/7. They're using their computers. Businesses are hosting their companies in the cloud. How do you see the alignment of these two different worlds, of the realities and expectations of the digital space these days?
Yeah, I think that's a debate that has been ongoing for a couple of years, especially in the Netherlands. We have seen it in the Amsterdam region, where there is a high concentration of data centers, both colocation data centers and larger hyperscale facilities, and especially in a city or a country that is densely populated with a scarcity of land. I can understand that people say, hey, you have all these big boxes there. They use potentially water. At least that's a potential misconception. Obviously, they use power, and then there might not be that many people working there. I do understand that from the outset. I think the reality is that everybody wants to have everything at their fingertips, right? They want to watch a Netflix movie when they are at home, when they are traveling. They want to be in 24/7 contact with the world, whether that's news, whether that's watching TV, whether that's watching movies, whether that's chatting, whether it's social media, anything digitally is kind of at the forefront of our fingertips, because we have a phone, we have a computer, and we're all connected to internet 24/7. To do that, you need to go to the cloud. At least that's the perception of everybody. Well, the cloud, that are obviously the data centers, right? It's not that
it exists. It's on land.
Yeah.
It's not floating up in the sky.
Exactly. These files are not up there in the sky, but they're actually sitting on servers somewhere in a data center, which can be a Mediterra data center, which can also be one of our competitors or one of the hyperscale data centers. But any click that anybody makes on their phone, any swipe, anything, means that some data needs to be pulled from the cloud, i.e. from a server in a data center, and sent back to that phone to kind of give you the WhatsApp message that your friend is sending you, or to actually start the movie that you want to start. And then there's a continuous kind of exchange of information between your phone and that server somewhere to provide you actually the next episode of Friends or any other series that you would like to look into. So to that extent, that's on a personal level. That already means that you need to have data centers, unless we all decide that we don't want that digitization. Equally important, or maybe even more important, for at least for our business, is the same is happening on the corporate side of things. So if you want to, in the past, when you had a bank account, you had to go to the bank to kind of transfer some money, etc. Nowadays, I think most people hardly go into a banking office because they will do everything online. So that means
I've been in once myself, so
exactly. There you go. I hardly get there either. But that is just for banking. But the same applies for utilities, or if you book, travel or anything that you can do in terms of a service or even a purchase. I mean, online shopping, just to name one. It's all happening online, which means that there is always information sent from your device, which can be a corporate one or a personal one, to some data center somewhere, and that returns a result to you, and maybe later on the mail will deliver what you just ordered online. So to that extent, that is required, I think, for where we stand in the world. And that also means that for many of these corporates that are actually making everything possible in terms of this digitization, they need to be relatively close to a part of their data center requirements. And that's where we come in. We want to be there close to them. We want to be able to provide the services that they require. And that means that sometimes there are these ugly boxes, at least they were in the past. I think nowadays the designs get also much better and they don't look as just a simple box. But yes, it is something that is there. It is, I think, there to stay, because the annual increase in the amount of data is staggering, right? I mean, it's only going up. And I always kind of compared, if you were to look at your iPhone 5 years ago, your average photo size would be a couple of 100 KBs, right? Nowadays, it's a couple of MBs, and it is expected to continue to grow, which means that not only are you using maybe more applications, but also the data within the application that you're using is becoming bigger. So it's growing basically on two axes, and I do expect that is going to continue.
I'm feeling that myself personally. I had a new iPhone update come over, and it's 15 gigabytes.
There you go.
Enormous. Would overpower phones from even a couple years ago right now, just trying to stuff something that big just for an update. I also think, too, that whatever marketing or branding team came up with the word cloud for data storage really misled people, because it sounds like you just, poof, it's gone. It's just up there. It just exists. There's no physical presence on land. But really it is, it's a physical data center. There's a lot there powering that. It's not light and floating around like the clouds are up in the sky, but understanding for people that, hey, all of the businesses in your community, everything that you're doing on your phone, the reason that you can access Netflix so easily wherever you are, commuting to work or at home in the evening, is because that data lives near you. And it is supporting what you as a consumer want, but then also what the local businesses need to survive. And so in that sense, having a data center in your region, in your city, really positions your city strong or on a strong economic footing.
Yeah, that is, I couldn't agree more. That's also how we look at our business, right? We want to be regional. We don't want to be only in, let's say, the key hubs, which for the countries that we are looking at is obviously Milan, Paris, and Madrid, and maybe Lisbon to a certain extent. Obviously, we want to be there as well, because it's typically a very good connectivity center in these largest cities. There's a lot of other data centers there, so that it means that there's simply a lot of traffic and connectivity and data center activities happening. So to that extent, we always want to be in those cities as well. But we also want to be in what we call tier 2 cities, which is maybe not the best name, but what we mean by that is not the kind of the key data center hubs of each country. So for instance, in Italy, that obviously is Milan. But we started out in Rome, and we bought something in Palermo. We expect to expand in other cities as well, and then ultimately we also would like to be in Milan to have a presence there. And we believe that is required to support the local communities, the local businesses in those other cities as well. Because if you live in Naples and your data center environment is in Milan and you need to do something, that will take you a day or two to get there and go back. Whereas if we were to be in Naples, it might be a 45-minute drive. You can do some maintenance on servers or swap a server, whatever it is that you need to do in our data center, and you don't lose a days of travel time. That is one point. So that's kind of some sort of convenience that we try to offer to our customers. The other point being is that, especially with the increase in data that is traveling around the world, also if you, at the same example, if your data would always be stored in Milan, but your business is in Naples, and the vast majority of your customers might also be in that region, all your data has to travel from Naples to Milan.
You get a lot of latency. Yep.
And then the latency
down.
might become an issue. That is not necessarily an issue for every application, right? Because 3, 4, 5, 6 milliseconds of latency for us as human beings, we will not notice. But at some point, for certain applications, that might become crucial. So therefore, you want to be closer to your data to not have any delays, or especially in relation to very large quantities of data, at some point, you also don't want it to have to travel too far, because there might ultimately also be capacity constraints on the network, or you have to rent a relatively expensive bandwidth all the way from Naples to Milan and back to simply get information on your screen. So to that extent, there's multiple cases why we believe it's very useful to be not too far away from the data, and therefore we want to be close to our end customers.
That makes sense. And the secondary cities are where, at least I see there's a lot of opportunity for growth, and that these primary cities, the big cities, they're being fought over by all the big data center companies. That is very much a Red Sea if we're talking blue ocean strategy. But these smaller secondary cities, they're more open to the investment. They don't have as many data centers yet. They need them to support their growing economies. And quite frankly as well, there's a lot more of them too that you can go out and look for across the regions that you're targeting.
No, fully agreed. And what we also see is that quite a few municipalities in, let's call it the secondary cities, are quite open to have a discussion on data centers. They might have some requirements, etc., but most of the time
Of course.
we can meet them without any problems. They also see that it is required for them to not be only dependent on, let's say, the big data center hub in their country, but sometimes municipalities and other local governments also have to store data. And typically, I don't know, whether it's Bologna or whether it's Naples or whatever, they would then like to have that data actually stored in their own city. As simple as that. So to that also kind of helps us in a discussion with the municipality to be able to get ultimately the permits for a data center. And we ultimately really focus on these local businesses, right? It can be the municipality, it can be semi or government linked bodies like hospitals that might require quite significant data center services, next to obviously the local businesses and potentially also international customers that we try to service, which means that we would be building also an ecosystem of customers and connectivity in such a local data center. And that in itself is an interesting development, not only for us, but also for these businesses, because they can connect directly in our data center to another service provider, which could speed up things for them or make things more efficient.
That makes a ton of sense. And so you've got a great strategy here for Mediterra coming up over the next several years between approaching these smaller communities or secondary cities, building out the data center infrastructure, and then also diversifying your development method through the acquisitions as well. What are you most looking forward to over the next 3, 4, 5 year time horizon here at Mediterra?
So we are obviously still in kind of the building phase. And well, actually, I think we will probably never be done with kind of building the company further. But today we are relatively small. We have only 2 operational data centers. We have 3 projects under development, and we have a pipeline of a number of projects that we are actively working on to hopefully secure. So ultimately, I would like to have probably around 20-ish data centers in these countries, in all kind of key cities, which is obviously the big cities, being it, I don't know, Milan and Paris and Madrid, but most importantly also in what we just discussed, the secondary cities, to be able to provide those services to these regions, to these countries, which I believe that they are going to need. We haven't discussed AI as of yet, but clearly that is another element that is going to impact also what we believe the Mediterra strategy and the Mediterra customer base and the demand from our customers and ultimately also the end users, which can be you and me.
That makes a lot of sense. Maarten, it sounds like you've got an incredible journey ahead of you here. Lots of fun things coming up on the horizon for Mediterra. Thank you very much for hopping on the podcast today and sharing your insights.
Thank you very much, Paul, for having me. And I really enjoyed the conversation we just had.
As always, thanks.
Connect with Paul at ketkeyconsulting.com or on LinkedIn. More episodes on the way. Reach out if you're ready to scale.